Welcome to Ancient World Studies. My name is Dr. Raoul McLaughlin. The question is, who were the Garamantes? And why did the Romans explore Inner Africa? Current reconstructions are often based on later historical developments, especially events in the medieval era, when Islamic merchants created important caravan routes across the Sahara. Many modern scholars therefore emphasize trade as a major factor in Roman expeditions into Inner Africa. They suggest that Roman officials were searching for new commercial routes that might bypass trade intermediaries or gain better access to distant resources. These resources included exotic animals and gemstones and African slaves from sub-Saharan territories. However, the evidence for this trade is extremely limited, and the narrative may be based on modern expectations. Many academic theories concerning ancient Trans-Saharan trade involve the Garamantes. By the Roman era, the Garamantes were occupying a large oasis zone in the central Sahara that extended across the Fezzan. Their territory was positioned deep in the desert, about 600 miles south of Regio Tripletania, and the largely barren coastline that connected Cyrenaica to Africa Proconsularis. Travellers leaving this coastline with camel teams could probably reach Garamantic territory in about 24 days. Pliny reports that the journey from a desert frontier settlement called Al-Jela to Garamantic territory required at least 12 days to complete. This is close to the limit of what could be accomplished without replenishing water supplies. Pliny describes routes into the desert at a time before mankind destroyed the inland belt of forests. He writes, "There are inland routes found by observation of the stars. These routes lead across a desert, abandoned to the sand, and teeming with serpents. Beyond this there are forests, filled with a multitude of wild beasts. Further inland are the desolate haunts of elephants. Then 12 days' journey from Alaja comes a vast desert, and beyond it, the Garamantes tribe." Archaeologists suggest that the oasis territories of the Garamantes were the most likely connecting points in a trans-Saharan commercial system involving the Romans. Consequently, this region of southern Libya was subject to extensive investigation by English and Italian archaeologists between the late 1990s and 2011. Their findings confirm that the Garamantes maintained a large and prosperous desert realm with sophisticated water management techniques. In prehistoric times, the Sahara had been a vast savanna with large interconnected lake systems in upland territories. But over hundreds of years, the desert expanded, vegetation was destroyed, and dune fields covered the region. During this period, large bodies of fresh water evaporated to leave salt sediments, or were sealed beneath the earth in rock strata as vast aquifers. Garamantic territory in the Fezzan was positioned on top of one of these vast underground water systems. This was significant because summer temperatures in this sun-scorched part of the desert can reach 55 degrees, and the average annual rainfall is less than half an inch. Often, there is no rainfall in these districts for several years. Early desert communities in the upland regions of the Fezzan learned how to access the aquifers by excavating springs and digging deep wells, which they lined with mixed stone and mud brick. Their early, sparsely settled communities were therefore established on hilltop promontories and escarpments, until the introduction of new technologies changed their fortunes. More efficient desert irrigation techniques were developed in Egypt, and these methods spread to the Fezzan soon after Herodotus wrote his account of Saharan travel. They included the use of what are called foggara systems, a type of qanat. Foggara were deep shafts excavated into the earth to access underground aquifers. Shafts were dug into the pediment, escarpment base, of the hamada, rock plateau, to access the sealed underground aquifer. Then by using the force of gravity, the outflowing water was directed down a slope through a system of artificial underground channels. These carefully arranged, subterranean channels were shielded from evaporation and converged to irrigate oasis sites in nearby desert valleys. They poured a continuous supply of fresh water into carefully managed crop plantations shaded by groves of fruit-bearing palm trees. The Foghra system allowed the Garamantes to transfer their habitations from the uplands to the valleys. Mud brick settlements appear in these low-lying regions sometime after 500 BC, confirming a population movement down the hillsides into more densely settled oasis-based communities. Over the course of several centuries, hundreds of Foghras were excavated in the territory, with new channels cut through compressed sand, gravel, clay, and sometimes chiselled through rock. Many channels were narrow, less than 2 feet wide and 5 feet high, with a series of regularly spaced vertical shafts every 30 feet to allow inspection, maintenance, and repair. Longer networks ran more than 30 feet under the searing desert surface to minimize water loss through evaporation. Their excavation and upkeep involved heavy labor in low light, deep underground in dangerous, cramped, and suffocating conditions. But this network greatly increased the surface area under cultivation and allowed the Garamantes to become a significant settled population. Foghra technology allowed the Garamantes to cultivate grain, produce fruit harvests, and even grow labor-intensive crops such as cotton in a carefully managed network of oasis sites. Excavation has confirmed the production of local dates, figs, grapes, olives, barley, and wheat. They also introduced sub-Saharan cereals, including drought-resistant pearl millet and sorghum, which is tolerant to high salinity and could be harvested in the summer months. Pigs, chickens, lambs, and cattle were also reared and slaughtered at these sites. At the height of their power, the Garamantes may have occupied 4 major oasis systems that formed a significant habitation zone and conduit through the desert. The main centre of Garamantic settlement stretched along an east-west depression called the Wadi Ajal. This ravine-like feature was close to 100 miles long and between 2 and 3 miles wide. To the north, the land was enveloped by sand from the desert dunes. To the south, the Wadi became a canyon, rising towards a high escarpment on the edge of a barren rock plateau. Either side of the Wadi was a fearsome desert landscape, entirely inimical to life. It was only the wells and Foghra water systems that sustained plants and peoples along this fertile belt of desert territory. Perhaps the Garamantes believed that they had tapped an underground river that would provide an endless supply of clear, fresh water to irrigate their oasis settlements. But their civilization depended on finite fossil water that had only been sealed in an elevated water table by exceptional geological circumstances. Each year depleted the underground reserves, and it was their fate for the channels to eventually run dry as the water table gradually dropped. By the medieval era, certain Foghras had already run dry, and the declining desert population began using wells to access the shrinking water table. In this later era, it required extensive labour from people and animals to draw water from these far less efficient well systems. Archaeologists engaged in surveying this landscape have used various methods to estimate the size of the ancient Garamantic population. Using aerial photography, they have deduced figures from settlement remains and cemetery sites, examined spoil rings caused by water flow, and surveyed the outline of irrigation systems that reveal the extent of ancient fields. Current evidence suggests that there are over 50 Garamantic villages along the Wadi, which may have sustained a population of up to 50,000 people. These villages were clusters of mud brick dwellings close to the Foghra field systems. From this central region, the Garamantic nation spread out along further Wadi and oasis sites to occupy 3 further fertile zones in the desert. 2 of the main oasis clusters extended along further desert depressions that stretched over 100 miles towards the southwest and the southeast. Some of the southern villages may exhibit sub-Saharan influence, with the arrangement of habitations around a central communal area. But this can only be confirmed by further excavation at ancient Swahili and southern Garamantic sites. Archaeologists suggest that across all 4 oasis zones, the Garamantic population may have reached 100,000. Up to 15,000 people may have lived in the villages or the larger urban clusters. To provide context, this was a population equivalent to a single standard-sized Roman city. The Garamantian capital, Garama, modern Jarma, was located in the northern region of the Wadi Ajal. It was a cluster of mud brick buildings, occupying an area of about 9 hectares. In total, the urban centre and its outlying settlements may have been inhabited by several thousand people. Excavation revealed the existence of at least 2 monumental buildings at the site, made from masonry blocks. One of these stone structures was a temple dedicated to the god Ammon. It incorporated features of classical Mediterranean architecture and had broad entrance steps and a columned porch. A nearby building, which may have been a royal residence, had a colonnaded courtyard with a narrow pilastered entrance. The remains of marble veneers and painted wall plaster suggest contact and influence from Mediterranean cultures. Fragments of hypocaust tiles and hydraulic cement suggests that the Garamantes received foreign engineers able to recreate elements of a Roman-style bathhouse at the site. Nearby cemeteries contain thousands of circular shaft and cairn burials marked by simple gravestones. Modern estimates calculate that more than 60,000 ancient grave sites exist along the Wadi, but this may be a fraction of the true figure. These graves, with their heavily eroded mud brick and stone markers, are the product of an entire millennium of death and burial by the ancient Garamantic population. In total, several hundred have been subject to modern excavation. Some of the more elaborate graves close to Garama have mud brick pyramids that rise to over 10 feet high and suggest early influence from Egypt. Later graves erected by the elite are small stone-built mausoleums that feature elements of classical architecture, including columns. Short funerary inscriptions appear on some graves. The messages are expressed in a mysterious script formed from circles, crosses, arrows, squares, and zigzags. The Garamantes also maintained livestock, including goats and sheep, as well as donkeys and horses for travel between their oasis outposts. This gave the ancient Garamantes the resources required to establish a significant Trans-Saharan trade. But did this trade ever develop? Did it ever become a large-scale enterprise connecting Roman territories to sub-Saharan Africa? Sub-Saharan trade. Some modern academics argue that the digging of fogaras and the production of cotton were difficult, labour-intensive activities that encouraged the Garamantes to import sub-Saharan peoples as slaves. During the medieval era, Islamic merchants transferred somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 African slaves across the Sahara per annum. Academics argue that the Garamantes also had the infrastructure and technology required to operate a slave trade on this same scale, and that Roman economic demand was large enough to manage this number of people and force them into slavery. However, these views can be challenged. Supporting evidence from the ancient sources is minimal, and Roman sites such as Leptis Magna have not produced archaeological evidence for an extensive slave trade from remote African peoples. A slave trade on the scale suggested by recent academics, would have imported over 500,000 sub-Saharan Africans into the Roman Empire within a century. With only about 50 million people in the entire empire, a population movement on this scale would have had an impact on Roman genetics. A major population ingress from sub-Saharan Africa would be demonstrated by genetic evidence present in ancient graves. It could also be determined from analysing the DNA of modern Mediterranean populations to discover part African ancestry. However, this evidence does not currently exist, and it therefore seems unlikely there was a large-scale slave trade. Consequently, it makes better sense to accept that sub-Saharan Africa was remote and largely separate from the Roman Empire. What is the evidence for Garamantic trade? The earliest reference to any sub-Saharan slave trade comes from the work of Herodotus in the 5th century BC. Herodotus suggests that the Garamantes used chariots to hunt down and capture African populations to the south of their territory. He reports that these Garamantes ride in their 4-horse chariots, pursuing the Ethiopians who dwell in depressions, watering holes. Ancient graffiti and rock carving from the Central Sahara confirm that the Garamantes used light chariots. Some of the riders are depicted with javelins and small round shields, confirming their skill in mobile warfare. A few artifacts excavated in the Fezzan indicate contacts with sub-Saharan Africa, but the finds are not extensive. For instance, a hematite black iron lip plug was found in a female Garamantic burial. The burial also contained a cowrie shell of sub-Saharan origin. Ivory ornaments have also been found in Garamantic graves, but this early evidence does not confirm a large-scale slave trade, especially for the Roman era. There is evidence for sub-Saharan slaves in the Roman Empire, but they probably arrived via the Red Sea trade routes, or the Nile route from Meroe, Meroe. In the 1st century BC, large numbers of Roman ships began sailing from Egypt to Somalia on voyages that extended far across the Indian Ocean. A 1st century merchant guidebook, called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, records how Roman traders received slaves from Somali ports. Some of these ships could carry over 230 tons of cargo, and therefore could have delivered a considerable number of African slaves into the empire. This is most likely the origin of many of the slaves described as Ethiopian in the ancient Roman texts. The evidence for Garamantic slave trade is minimal, but certain texts are cited as possible proof. Ostracon, pottery tokens, scratched with messages, have been found at the Roman frontier fort of Bu-Negem. One token records how Garamantes arrived with a fugitive Roman slave, possibly to collect a reward on the runaway. Another token mentions black slaves, but the origin and purpose of this labour team are not recorded. An ostracon from the island of Jarba, off the coast of modern Tunisia, refers to a slave trader involved in a transaction, but there is no indication of his business practices or the origin of his slaves. It could be that much of the seasonal labour requirements in North Africa were met by nomad groups from the semi-desert, who would regularly enter Roman territory during the harvesting season. This might have diminished the need for a large-scale permanent slave labour force in the agricultural zones. Garamantes appear as possible slaves in 2 Latin texts, but these were written in late antiquity, around the time the Western Empire was in its final decline. An anonymous poem evokes imagery associated with filth and the underworld to disparage a dark-skinned character. The first verse reads, "This Garamantian filth has just entered our space. This black man born to be a slave is even proud of his pitch-black skin." But this short poem finishes with references to mythology and the claim, Hades' house should have him as a guard. A 6th century poet named Luxurius criticized a Roman named Myro for pursuing dark-skinned prostitutes who were low status and possible slaves. He writes, "Admit it, Myro, a Pontic girl doesn't do it for you, but a Garamantian one does." The poet therefore contrasts the palest skinned women from the Caucasus with those with the darkest complexions. This is minimal evidence for a large-scale trade in African slaves, and perhaps the poet simply invoked the Garamantes to exaggerate the concerns that many Romans had about distantly foreign peoples. An inscription from Rome refers to Garamalus, which is a diminutive form of the name Garamantes, and could refer to a child. But slaves could earn their freedom in Roman society, and Garamantic travellers might enter Roman territory as free peoples. 2 Latin inscriptions from North Africa commemorate wives who had names derived from the word Garamantes. One inscription records how Publiae Aemiliae Garamantiae was married to a magister from the town of Novarica in Mauritania, Caesarensis. Some Garamantes might have been taken to Rome as war captives, where they later earned their freedom or passed their skills to freeborn citizen descendants. One inscription from the capital refers to a Garamantica Gentinica, described as a charioteer with one of the 4 leading racing factions. Another freedman named Marcus Nutius Marci was a charioteer with a racing team described as Garamantic, factio Garamantinicae. Perhaps Marcus Nutius had Latinized his Garamantic name and adopted the cognomen of his Roman patron. These Africans may have been sought after for their renowned chariot warrior skills. But there is other evidence that the Romans traded with the Garamantes, and valuable commodities were involved. Ancient accounts describe a reddish-brown gemstone that the Romans called Carthaginian Carbuncles. These gemstones were known as Carthaginian because the Romans originally received them through merchant intermediaries from the Carthaginian realms. In fact, the gems were a type of carnelian found in a region of the central Sahara occupied by the Garamantes. The gemstones were gathered as surface finds from gravel fields eroded from rock outcrops in the deep desert. They were therefore an ideal small, yet high-value, item for peoples making long desert crossings. Pliny the Elder describes Garamantic carbuncles as having a fiery red appearance. Garamantic gems better reflected light and therefore enhanced the coloration and shine of surrounding pearls or precious stones. These stones had strange light-reflective properties and seemed to shimmer like oil. Some of these carnelian pieces possibly reached Roman territory via the Nile, and Pliny may be referring to trade through Meroe when he describes a form of carbuncle arriving from the Ethiopians. Pliny also mentions a Roman innovation that may have reduced the demand for Garamantic carnelians. He reports that Roman workshops had learnt how to replicate the appearance of these gemstones in glass. These glass copies could be identified by scoring or marking the surface as it was more susceptible to damage. Sometimes small particles of silica might be seen in the replicas, or the less dense glass versions could be identified using precise scales to weigh the item. Other semi-precious gemstones were found in the central Sahara, including green amazonite. Archaeologists have found this semi-precious stone during excavations at Garamantic settlements and grave sites in the Fezzan. Access to other markets in the east may have limited Roman demand for Garamantic gemstones. Pliny reports that by the imperial era, other valuable red gemstones were available to the Romans, including supplies from India. Indian carbuncles were paler than the Garamantic variety, but they were significantly larger. By the imperial era, the Romans were also exploiting emerald mines in the eastern desert of Egypt, which produced gemstones far superior to Garamantic green Amazonite. Roman ships returned from the Tamil kingdoms of southern India with blue and green beryl gemstones, which were admired for their colour and translucency. Merchants from the empire also began to locate markets in India that could supply rubies as a high-value alternative to carnelian. The trade in carnelian may have been a valuable revenue source for the early Garamantes, but this was a product of the desert, not the sub-Sahara. Other items have been suggested as Garamantic trade goods, including exotic creatures and animal pelts. Lucian suggests that the Garamantes hunted ostriches, elephants, and monkeys. Across the Roman Empire, wild animals were displayed in popular public arenas. The animals were often made to perform in staged hunts, or slaughtered by specialist gladiator-type combatants known as bestiarii. Predators such as lions would be set loose upon condemned criminals or made to fight other animals in arranged combats. The most dramatic shows included wild animals captured in Africa. Evidence comes from ancient accounts, mosaics, stone reliefs, and other forms of Roman art. Archaeologists have also found remains of these animals at Roman sites, including a butchered leg joint of a giraffe, discovered during recent excavations at Pompeii. Ostrich eggshells have also been found in Pompeii, in the house of the Greek epigrams. The problem with establishing a Garamantic origin for these animals is that many of these rare species were common in North Africa during the Roman era. There were also other routes for the ancient African animal trade, including the Nile trade through Meroe. The Romans imported tigers and other exotic animals from India, so it was possible to transfer animals from the Red Sea ports to Egypt. Roman ships, based in the Red Sea, could have collected captured beasts in Somalia or other trade outposts further down the east coast of Africa. This might have been an easier option than bringing animals 1,000 miles through the central Sahara Desert. Ultimately, this issue will be resolved by modern scientific techniques. For example, archaeologists studying bone fragments can now determine the regions where animals originated or were nurtured, using a technique called isotope analysis. It could be significant that Garamantes do not appear in the records as venatores or gladiatorial beast hunters. Perhaps this undermines the modern theory of a regular Trans-Saharan trade in exotic animals. Was Garamantic territory well connected to the Roman economy? This is difficult to determine, but significant amounts of Roman artifacts have been found in the Fezzan. Archaeologists conducted field surveys of Garamantic sites with Roman pottery noted among surface finds. They have also excavated the remains of ancient settlements and cemeteries in the region and found a variety of relatively commonplace Roman artifacts. This includes pottery associated with garum fish oil containers, fine tableware, and Roman glassware. These objects could have been traded for local products including dates, fruits, or cotton produced in the larger oasis groves. Some Garamantic traders could also have brought grain and other essential supplies to outlying forts on the extreme south of Roman territory. This is confirmed by an ostracon discovered at a Roman fort on the southern frontier, Bugem. The pottery fragment was scratched with a message confirming that Garamantes had arrived with their donkeys and delivered grain to the garrison at the oasis. Salt may have formed a significant export from the desert, and many of the Roman imports visible in the archaeological records of Garamantic society could be trade goods exchanged for this valuable resource. In ancient times, salt was an important preservative, especially for meat, and a significant additive for flavouring. This resource would have been particularly important for Roman garrisons stationed on relatively remote frontiers. Unlike other exports, blocks of salt would leave little or no remains in the archaeological record. Perhaps trade between Garamantic territory and the Roman coast was also managed and maintained by intermediary Berber populations. One of the closest Berber populations to the Garamantes were the Gattolians, who inhabited a vast strip of territory on the desert margins. They were well-known animal breeders and raised a vast stock of colts, possibly for trade with other nations. Strabo explains that the land of the Garamantes is beyond that of the Gattolians, and the regions lie parallel, with the Garamantes supplying the Carthaginian stones. Strabo also offers updated information about where Garamantic territory might be positioned in relation to other ancient territories. He suggests it was 15 days' travel from the Ammon oasis, which is shorter than the 20-day route outlined by Herodotus. Perhaps this was because the Garamantes had expanded their desert territory east towards Egypt. Or perhaps travellers made greater use of camels to cross the more arduous routes. Despite this evidence, the scale of commerce between the Garamantes and the Roman territories is not attested in the surviving sources. Taken over many decades, it could have been significant, but in terms of day-to-day economic activities, the trade may have been relatively unimportant. Based on sample excavations, archaeologists suggest that up to 400 tons of Roman pottery could have been buried at the largest Garamantic cemetery. This is an impressive figure, but it could have been accumulated over several centuries. 4 camels can transport a ton of cargo, and a cameleer can control 6 camels tethered in tandem. Therefore, a continuous, relatively small-scale trade occurring annually could account for the known archaeological remains. Perhaps there was no large-scale Trans-Saharan commerce operating in antiquity, at least not through the territory of the Garamantes. This would explain why the Romans had such a limited knowledge and understanding of sub-Saharan Africa. Throughout the Roman era, perceptions of the Garamantes were based on limited encounters in the desert margins, where teams of long-range Garamantic hunters could sometimes be encountered. Writing in the 2nd century, Lucian offers a popular view of the nation. The Garamantians dwell on the desert frontiers. They are a lightly clad, agile tribe of tent dwellers, subsisting mainly by hunting. These are the only people who occasionally penetrate the desert in pursuit of game. Outsiders did not generally know about the Foggara systems, or perhaps discounted fabulous stories of clear water streams erupting from the desert. The location of desert wells and watering places were also concealed, so, for the Romans, passage into or out of the inner desert was a subject of speculation. Lucian deduced. The Garamantes wait till rain falls, about the winter solstice, mitigating the excessive heat, moistening the sand, and making it just passable. Their quarry consists chiefly of wild asses, the giant ostrich that runs instead of flying, also monkeys, and the elephant is sometimes hunted. These are the only creatures sufficiently proof against thirst and capable of bearing that incessant fiery sunshine. Lucian also emphasizes the risks involved in travel to and from the inner desert. He warned, as soon as the Garamantians have consumed the provisions they bring with them on their travels, they instantly hurry back to their homeland, for they fear the sand will recover its heat and become difficult or impassable, in which case they would be trapped and lose their lives. The account suggests that even in the 2nd century AD, Roman contact or knowledge with the Garamantes was limited. Thank you for your attention.